Well, it's so good to have all of you here at Table of Grace as we celebrate VBS and also continue our sermon series at the movies with Moana. How many of you have seen Moana? Most everybody? How many of you would say Moana is your favorite movie? You just give a shout out like, woo! All right, we've got a fan. We got one fan of Moana. That's so awesome. Well, we're so glad that you're part of this. And so just a moment ago, we sang Never Let Go of Me, and that was a completely new song for our VBS kiddos. And so we're going to sing the other version of Never Let Go of Me after communion. And so we'll invite all of our VBS friends to come back up after communion, and we're going to sing that song together. Does that sound good? All right. Well, as we continue today, I invite you to look at Matthew chapter 14 as we look at another amazing story of Jesus calling his disciples. And it says this: immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go out ahead of him to the other side. And while he dismissed the crowd, and after he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. And later that night, he was there alone. And the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. But shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them walking on the lake. And when the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and walked on water and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" And immediately Jesus reached out his hand, and he caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And then they climbed into the boat. The wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." You know, a question that we all have to answer in our life is, who are we? What are we meant for? What are we supposed to do in our lives? And so often this question of identity or this question of calling, we try to fill it with maybe our family that we came from. You know, this is who our family of origin is, and this is who I am. Or maybe we try to fill it with a vocation or sometimes even a relationship. But really, so often I would hope, and in my life, I always just dreamed it was easy enough that the ocean would choose me and just dump a bunch of water on me, right? A lot like Moana. That would be that easy. But sometimes it's so incredibly hard to figure out what our place in the world is. And so often we talk about this in terms of calling, and calling is this place in which who we are, our talents, our experiences, our gifts, that all of that lines up with a need in the world. That we just fit right into place, and this is who we are, and this is our place in the world. But the challenge becomes is when we face those struggles or those storms of life. Those times in which we have circumstances or decisions or tragedies or failures that really knock us off course. And we lose our way. And maybe we even kind of give up and we settle. But what if these storms in life that we face are not the end of our stories, but they're just the beginning? What if storms really become the context of discovering who we are? What if storms really are the context in which miracles can occur? What if storms are the time in which we see ourselves and discover that we're stronger than we'd ever realize because of the God who's at work among us and in our life? And that's what I love about Moana. Because we see Moana's story that she's the daughter of the chief, and she really just has this plan for her life that she's going to become the chief of her tribe and of her people, and that she's supposed to step into her place, into the world, and yet she's drawn to the sea, she's drawn to the ocean, and she's even had this moment where the sea has called to her, but it seems like a dream. But then she has this task, the heart of Tafiti. And as her grandma kind of shows her, is that she really does have a mission she must complete. She has to go and to save her people. And so she sets out to find the one person that last had the heart, and that is Maui. And so with all of her enthusiasm, Moana sets out. She crosses the reef, but the first thing that happens to her is she encounters a storm. Sometimes storms lead us right where we need to be. And in this story, we see the disciples are out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee, and the waves are coming up, the winds are blowing, and they're in this situation that they would never want to be in, out on the sea in the middle of the night when a storm is beginning to swell. But Jesus is the one who set them out upon the lake. As they were gathered together, they had this incredible experience with Jesus, that Jesus has called them and he began to teach them. And then Jesus had found this place where 5,000 people were gathered together, and they weren't really sure how they were going to feed everyone. But Jesus took bread and he broke it and he gave it to them. And they went and they fed 5,000 people in that crowd. And then it tells us that immediately Jesus told them to get into the boat and to go to the other side of the lake. And so they gathered in their boat. Jesus stayed behind to pray and to dismiss the crowd. And as it got late into the night, the waves began to pick up, the winds began to blow, and Jesus was nowhere to be found. And what I love about this story is that oftentimes this is what it's like and maybe feels like in the life of those who follow Jesus. So often we can think about, following Jesus looks maybe more like, Mr. Rogers, will you come and be my neighbor? And it just seems so nice. And we have these little puppets that live in the wall or something, and it just everything seems so great. And we can kind of wonder, why are these storms in our lives? Why do things not quite work out? And yet this is the experience of the disciples, that Jesus has led them to this moment where they're going to discover something about God and about themselves, and how God is with them in the midst of this. Because as they cry out into fear, just imagine what it is, kind of put ourselves in these disciples' shoes. Because as they're out on this lake, that this is a picture to them of not just a storm, but the waters really were a picture of the chaotic waters of creation. It tells us in Genesis chapter 1 that the Spirit of the Lord hovered over the waters, that God calmed the waters, that he called out land out of the waters, that God created the animals and the beast of the waters, that God really was in control of all of these chaotic waters. And the fishermen knew this because they'd experienced water. They knew what it was like, and they would never choose to be there on their own if their master hadn't sent them out. And yet here they were, experienced with boats and with water, but they were stuck, and there's nothing that they could do. But it's precisely in that moment when rescue came to them. As we look at this next clip from Moana, we see that Moana has found Maui, and she's set off, and they found Maui's hook, and they're ready to go and to face Takai, that big volcanic lava monster that's guarding Te Fiti. And as they encounter Takai, Takai defeats them. And as they wash away, Maui says, "I'm done with this. Are you sure the ocean even called you? Maybe you heard it wrong. I'm out of here." And he leaves Moana lost, abandoned, and alone. But it's in just that moment her grandmother comes to her. It's in that moment of the waves and the wind and the panic that Jesus walks out to the disciples. And this isn't a moment in which Jesus is defying gravity, although that would be cool, right? But this is a moment in which Jesus is walking on the wind and the waves, that Jesus is walking upon the chaos, that Jesus is walking upon the storm, that Jesus is saying, "I own these waves. I own these winds. These are mine. I got this." Jesus is not afraid of the storm. And he walks out there to them. And the disciples see him and they think he's a ghost. And they're even more afraid. And he says to them, "It is I am. Don't panic. Take courage." I just imagine that Peter, I mean, he's not really kind of the bold Peter, although he just can't help himself, but he's just kind of like, hey, Jesus, if it's you, call out to me and, I'll walk out there to you. And Jesus says, come. And Peter steps out onto that water, owning the winds, owning the storm. The storm doesn't own him anymore. The storm does not define him anymore. And he walks upon the waves and the water and joins Jesus in this moment. Have you ever wondered what it's like to really do the impossible? We can face these situations in our lives and we can say, you know what, these are the moments I knew was going to happen. When I thought about this, when I thought I was going to step out, when I knew I was going to take this chance, when I was going to step out into this unknown, I knew it was going to go like this. I knew it wasn't going to go this way. And yet that's the context in which miracles happen. That's a context in which we can see God clearly. This week I came across the story of Janine Shepherd. And Janine Shepherd was a born natural athlete. She was a track star, a sprinter. She really had her pick of any sports, and so she chose cross-country skiing. And she was so great at cross-country skiing that she decided on her own that she was going to represent Australia in the Olympics and really just show the world that Australia really can do winter sports. Because this is the kind of athlete that she is, and she would train day in and day out. She would train, and people even called her Janine the Machine. Her whole identity was in training. And she was the early favorite to win the gold medal in the 1996 Olympics. That is until one day she was taking a bike ride as part of her training. And as a part of the course that she loved, there was lots of hills, and she was kind of 10 minutes in front of the finish line, and she stood up on her bike to really begin to pump through that last bit of hills and to really, really kind of get into it. And then everything just went black. A truck had hit her. And she broke her neck and her back in 6 places. Her side was lacerated, and they were barely able to save her life. And they told her she would never walk again. And she said throughout this experience, she said it took a lot of time, but as they would tell her she would never walk again, she said she wouldn't believe it. Because everything that she lived for, all of who she was wrapped up in being an athlete, of training her body, of accomplishing goals, of pushing through. And she goes on to say, the thing that she had to learn as she laid in bed, as all of her friends went on with training, as the Olympics came and went, she said all that she could think about is this, that you never know how strong you are until you have to be strong. You never know how strong you really are until you have to be strong. And that's what I think about when I see this from Moana. She has to discover that this call of the sea and this call of the people is not something that has to be thrust upon her, but it's something she has to discover on her own. That she had to decide that she was going to step out and to do the very thing she felt inside that she had to do. And Janine went on to not only walk again, but to have 3 children. She became a pilot, an aerobatics instructor. Because for us, when we face these storms in life, these storms don't define who they are. They become the context from which miracles can happen as God works through us. So as Moana discovers what it is she has to do, she goes and she faces Takai, but not in the same way she did last time. Ephesians 1:19-20 says this, I pray that you will understand the incredible greatness of God's power for us who believe in him. This is the same mighty power that raised Christ from the dead. See, whatever storm you may be facing today, whatever storms there have been in your lives, or maybe you've had those moments where you've You felt like that you are shipwrecked, and you wonder, how do the pieces come back together again? This is the moment in which Jesus is calling out to you. Come, walk upon the water with me. Walk upon these storms. Walk upon these waves. Don't be afraid. See them the way that I see them. Join me here. Because I believe when we are ready to say yes to God, when we're ready to climb out of that boat, which, by the way, Jesus had been inviting Peter out of that boat every time he sees Peter. He's saying, Peter, move away from that place where you're comfortable. Move away from that place that defines you, but come to the place where I define you. Because when we do that, it's the grace of God in our lives that calls to us and says that you are a son and that you are a daughter. Because when we know that, we can help other people see that grace too. Will you pray with me? God, I thank you for your love and for your grace that comes to us before we even know it, that says to us that we belong to you, that calls us out upon the waves, that says to us the wind and the storms do not define us, but you do. So God, may we hear your voice today. In Jesus' name, amen.